Rain lashed down on the city as Detective Ricardo, a man who didn't believe in ghosts, felt a shiver crawl down his spine. A scream echoed through the dark night, a cry of pure terror that seemed to come from within the old abandoned mansion. It was Isabella's scream, the modern witch he both admired and feared. Had something horrible happened to her? A supernatural danger threatened, invisible but very real. And Ricardo knew he had to enter that cursed house, even if it meant facing his greatest fears. The rain hammered against the windows, as if tiny hands were trying to force their way in. Outside, the wind howled a terrifying song, a song Ricardo knew all too well, the song of danger. He was drenched, water streaming down his leather jacket, but the cold he felt came from much deeper than the storm. That scream, Isabella's scream, still echoed in his ears, a thin thread of terror cutting through the silence of the night. She possessed a power he didn't understand, a power of witchcraft that put her in contact with a world that he, an experienced detective, could only imagine. But now, that world seemed to have drawn too close. The mansion loomed imposingly in the darkness, a sinister silhouette against the stormy sky. It seemed to breathe, its dark windows like empty orbits. Ricardo took a deep breath, the air heavy with humidity, and fear? He wouldn't admit it to anyone. But the truth was that the idea of entering that place haunted even him. A man who had always prided himself on his courage and skepticism. With every step he took towards the front door, the old, rotting wood groaning under his feet, the feeling of danger increased. He remembered Isabella's words, the stories she told about the ancient guardians, powerful beings who protected the balance between worlds, beings that could be extremely dangerous if disturbed. Had one of them escaped? Had one of them attacked Isabella? The possibility, once abstract, now struck him with brutal force. He had always thought her witchcraft was just a tale, an elaborate illusion skill, but now he doubted. Fear, cold and heavy as a cloak, covered him completely. The door creaked open with a bang that echoed into the night. The air inside the mansion was cold and damp, with a strange smell of earth and something indefinable. Something that sent chills down his spine. Ricardo switched on his flashlight, the beam of light cutting through the darkness, revealing a long, shadowy corridor with walls covered in cobwebs and decaying furniture. Each step echoed. Each shadow seemed to have a life of its own, ready to stretch out and grab him. Suddenly, a sound, a slight scraping, almost imperceptible. Ricardo froze, his hand closing around his holster. He turned slowly, searching for the source of the sound. It was almost imperceptible, subtle, like the breath of a lurking animal. A tremor ran down his spine. He didn't believe in ghosts, but what if, just what if, that sound was something else? Something that escaped his logic, his understanding? He continued to advance, his flashlight frantically searching for any sign of Isabella. Then he saw her. At the end of the corridor, a figure lying on the ground, enveloped in a strange, bluish, almost ethereal mist. It was Isabella, her breathing weak and shallow. She seemed unconscious, her face pale as the moon. Ricardo ran towards her, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached her and examined her carefully. There were no visible injuries, but she was very weak, as if she had lost all her vital energy. And then he noticed something else. Enveloping Isabella, beyond the blue mist, was a dark, almost black aura, pulsating with a shadowy and threatening energy. It was a malignant presence. Something ancient. Something that the skeptical detective, Ricardo, had never seen and never imagined. He felt an even greater cold. A cold that penetrated his bones. A cold that had nothing to do with the torrential rain outside. He knew at that moment that he was facing something far, far beyond his experience. And far beyond his control. A challenge beyond the two worlds. A conflict that promised to mix magic and reality in a terrible way. The fight for Isabella's life, and perhaps even for his own survival, had only just begun. The bluish mist enveloping Isabella pulsed, as if breathing, and the black aura intensified, creating a kind of whirlpool of shadows around her. Ricardo felt the dark energy, an oppressive presence that chilled his blood. It wasn't just cold. It was a feeling of pure evil, of a deep and ancient darkness. He remembered Isabella's stories about the Guardians, and a fear greater than the fear of death invaded him. It wasn't a rational fear, it was an ancestral fear, a fear that dwelled in the depths of the human soul, a fear that screamed at him to flee, to hide. But he couldn't. He had to save Isabella. With trembling hands, Ricardo tried to touch Isabella, but an invisible force repelled him. It was as if an invisible barrier separated him from her, protecting the black aura. The feeling of helplessness hit him hard, like a punch to the stomach. He was a detective, accustomed to solving mysteries, to finding solutions. But here, faced with this supernatural force, he felt completely lost, a helpless boy facing a menacing giant. Suddenly, a bright light emerged from the necklace Isabella was wearing, a necklace that Ricardo had never noticed before. A silvery light, cutting through the darkness, almost like a small star casting its rays against the darkness. The black aura receded for a moment, and Ricardo seized the opportunity to touch Isabella. Her skin was cold, like marble, but he felt a slight pulse, a sign of life. At the same moment, a whisper echoed down the corridor, a thin and terrifying voice, like the scraping of nails on a coffin. It was an ancient voice, laden with immense hatred, a hatred that seemed to echo through the centuries. Ricardo tried to understand the words, but they were like a labyrinth of incomprehensible sounds, like a dead language he had never learned. But the threat was clear. The fury was palpable. The black aura regrouped, even more intense, even more menacing. Ricardo felt a wave of dark energy hitting him, like an electric shock, causing him to stagger. He gritted his teeth, struggling to maintain his balance, his hand trembling over the gun at his waist. He knew he couldn't fight that with a common weapon, but he needed to protect Isabella, even if he didn't know how. He needed something more, something that only Isabella knew, something related to her magic, to her supernatural power, a knowledge that he, the skeptical detective, never believed had existed. He looked at the silver necklace, the only point of light in that sea of darkness. He remembered what Isabella had told him about the ancient guardians, about the balance between worlds, about the ancestral power she carried. This was his only hope. A fragile hope, almost invisible, but shining like a hesitant flame in the midst of the storm. Ricardo knew he needed to help Isabella use this power, to awaken the ancestral strength that lay dormant within her. It was his chance, his only chance to break the curse that imprisoned her and defeat the dark force that threatened them both. Time was running out. The darkness was closing in, and Ricardo knew that the fight for survival was far from over. The mystery was becoming increasingly frightening, more dangerous, more real. And it all depended on the strength of that witch and the courageous heart of the detective who was beginning to believe in the impossible. The rain beat hard against the windows of the abandoned mansion, a frantic rhythm accompanying the despair in Ricardo's heart. Isabella's scream still echoed in his ears, a scream of pure terror that had torn through the silence of the night. He found her lying on the floor, enveloped in a blue mist and a sinister black aura, a malignant presence pulsating with a shadowy energy that chilled the soul. It was as if an invisible monster was sucking the life out of her, leaving her weak, almost extinct. Ricardo, the skeptical detective, felt for the first time a fear that transcended logic, an ancestral, profound fear that took his breath away. He didn't believe in ghosts, but the reality before him was undeniable, palpable, terrifying. He tried to touch her, but an invisible force repelled him, like a barrier of dark energy. The helplessness hit him with full force, a brutal blow to his unwavering confidence. He was a detective, a solver of mysteries, but here, faced with this supernatural force, he felt small, insignificant, lost in a sea of shadows. The black aura pulsed, intensified, as if gaining strength with each passing second. A cold, ancestral whisper echoed down the corridor. Incomprehensible words, a dead language laden with ancient hatred, with a rage that seemed to echo through the centuries. A clear, palpable threat that made him tremble. It was then that he noticed Isabella's necklace, a silvery gleam, a small star cutting through the darkness. A light that cut through the black aura, weakening it for a moment. A breach, an opportunity. He seized the opportunity, touching her carefully, feeling her skin cold as marble, her pulse weak but present. It was a sign, a minimal hope amidst the despair. The black aura reacted with fury, unleashing a wave of dark energy that struck him, throwing him backward, making him stagger. Ricardo held on with all his might, the sharp pain cutting through his body, but the image of the silver necklace kept him focused. He remembered Isabella's stories, the guardians, the balance between worlds, the ancestral power she carried, a dormant power that needed to be awakened. He knew he couldn't face it with a weapon, with conventional methods. It was a spiritual battle, a war between light and darkness. He needed to help Isabella access her inner strength, to awaken the power that protected her, that could banish the darkness. The only way out was through magic, through the ancestral power that he, the skeptical detective, never believed existed, but which now, faced with Isabella's imminent death, he had to accept. It was a race against time, against an ancient and menacing supernatural power. A fight for his life, and for the life of the woman he was beginning to love. He approached her again, holding her necklace with a trembling hand, feeling the silvery light radiating energy. He repeated in a low voice the name of the ancestral guardians that Isabella had mentioned, invoking the ancestral force, asking for protection. It was a desperate plea, a prayer to an unknown force, to a world he could barely comprehend. But it was at that moment, at this crucial point in the fight, that something changed. The blue mist pulsed with more force, the necklace's glow intensified, and a wave of energy emanated from Isabella, a powerful and luminous force that pushed the black aura back, breaking the invisible barrier. The malignant presence groaned, a terrifying and agonizing sound, as if something ancient and powerful were being defeated. The dark energy receded, weakening, losing strength. Ricardo saw Isabella open her eyes, her blue eyes shining with an intense light, a magical, powerful glow. She sat up, her breathing now stronger, more stable. The silver necklace shone brightly before losing its brilliance and returning to its normal appearance. The black aura disappeared completely. Silence returned to the mansion, interrupted only by the incessant rain outside. Ricardo realized that the fight wasn't over yet, but they had survived. For now. The danger hadn't dissipated. It had only transformed. He held her, relief mingling with a deep fear, a certainty of the continuation of the battle. A different cold invaded him, no longer the cold of fear, but the cold of perception. They had won a battle, but the war between the two worlds had only just begun. Their survival depended on the power of magic, Isabella's strength, and the courage, increasingly inexplicable, of Detective Ricardo. The bluish mist enveloping Isabella dissipated, leaving behind only the faint glow of the silver necklace around her neck. The heavy air of darkness that oppressed Ricardo's chest was gone, replaced by an unexpected feeling of emptiness, as if an immense presence had withdrawn, leaving a disturbing silence in its place. Isabella opened her eyes, her blue eyes shining with a strength Ricardo had never seen before, a strength that radiated an ancient and mysterious power. She coughed, a dry, raspy cough, but her movements were firm, determined. She was alive, and that was all that mattered for now. Ricardo, still trembling, embraced her tightly, feeling the warmth of her body against his. Fear still haunted him, an echo of terror that resonated in his bones, but Isabella's survival was a balm to his wounded soul. He knew, however, that the threat had not completely disappeared. The feeling of danger still hanging in the air was as strong as the rain falling outside. Something had been expelled, momentarily defeated. But what was it? And what would happen if that shadowy entity returned? Isabella, still gasping for breath, said something in a language Ricardo didn't understand, an ancient and mysterious murmur, as if she were speaking to someone invisible, to something that inhabited the depths of the mansion. She then looked at Ricardo, her eyes filled with a deep sadness, a pain that transcended human comprehension. "It's not over, Ricardo," she said, her voice weak but firm. "He's back. And this time, he's stronger." Ricardo, who had begun to feel confident with the apparent victory, felt ice forming in his veins. The word "he" sounded like an omen of something terrible, something even more frightening than the shadowy entity that had attacked them. Who was he? And how had he become stronger? The questions echoed in his mind, the silence of the mansion muffling the answers. At that moment, a sound of breaking glass echoed from upstairs, followed by a metallic sound dragged across the old wood. It was a heavy sound, a sound that sucked all of Ricardo's hope away. He felt a wave of cold run down his spine. He looked at Isabella, who also stared at him, her face tense, her lips pale, and her eyes full of fear. The fear was not for herself, but for what they were about to face. An ancestral fear that transcended the boundaries of the spiritual world and extended to the physical world, making it clear that the battle was far from over, and that the victory thus far obtained was just an illusion. It was a pause between rounds. The darkness that had previously been concentrated around Isabella had now spread throughout the mansion, and it wasn't ordinary darkness. It was different. It was living darkness. Ricardo realized that they were trapped in a web of mystery, a game of supernatural power where the rules were unknown, and the enemies infinite. The mansion, the setting of the previous fight, was now transforming into a prison of shadows, and the fight was far from over. The threat was greater than they had ever imagined. Much greater. Above them, something stirred, and a chilling sound, a sound that resonated with the weight of centuries of darkness, echoed through the corridors. Ricardo felt Isabella's hand grasp his, her touch icy, her fear palpable, and then a silence. A deafening silence that made the imminent presence of an invisible threat clearer. Something so powerful and terrible that breathing itself seemed an act of defiance. What was moving in the shadows above them? What terrible power was preparing to destroy everything that had been built? What awaited them? Upstairs, a pair of red eyes gleamed in the darkness. Eyes that watched, planned, waiting for the right moment to strike. Eyes of something ancient, something cursed. Something that existed long before Ricardo and Isabella, and that had sworn vengeance. The fight for their hearts, their lives, was only just beginning. The war between the two worlds, now, had a new enemy, stronger, crueler, and more relentless than anything they could have imagined. The game had changed, and there was no longer room for doubt, only the fight for survival. Their survival depended on discovering the true nature of the threat, but time was running out. With every passing second, the danger intensified, and they were alone, completely alone, in the midst of a darkness that seemed to have no end.